Hello everyone and welcome back into the final edition of the week here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Christopher Shepard. As always, thank you for joining me on this lovely Friday afternoon. We have a great show ahead talking all things NBA All-Star Weekend, whether it be the new format, who was left out potentially, and how these different contests are looking, especially the dunk contest, as we have a rare opportunity there to talk about. But ultimately, should be a very fun show. And we conclude our show with a final Bubble Watch segments talking about some mid-major teams to look out for as potential Cinderellas in your bracket come March Madness time. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, as always, if you haven't done so already and you feel so inclined, like, follow, and subscribe to all our shows in the network itself to keep up to date with all the new content that goes on around the GSMC network. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly whilst we are live streaming, consider availing yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, where you can leave all things such as feedback, opinion, inputs throughout the show, as well as tips and donations, and everything that you do for our shows is genuinely appreciated, and it just makes them that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to them. But without further ado, let us jump right into this All-Star Weekend talk. Now, before we get into anything, I do want to clarify that this was kind of planned before the draft, before we fully understood what this format was going to be. So I apologize if I don't necessarily come across as, say, too knowledgeable about certain players within the format and how this will all work and pan out. But fortunately, I do feel like this show will run as smoothly as possible because I did do enough research to where I feel like I can at least talk with the players rather than focus on the format. But for those who potentially are not that familiar with the format, I'll briefly go over before we get into talking about the players, especially within the Eastern Conference, because I think that's the conference with a lot of controversy in terms of starters and reserves. So, in terms of format, it's going to be a 4-team format. So, it's basically Shaq, Kenny Smith, and Charles Barkley having teams based on a certain categorization. For example, Shaq's team's going to be the OGs, Kenny's going to be like the young stars of the league, and Charles gets all the international stars. And then the 4th team will be coached by Candace Parker, and it'll be the winner, I believe, of the Rising Stars competition, which has its own little format as well. But I do think that in this format, it gets us to better determine and analyze who we believe was snubbed and who we believe does not necessarily deserve as many players, especially in the Eastern Conference, because the Eastern Conference, I don't necessarily believe is as stacked as the Western Conference, but still has a lot of contentious points to talk about. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off with the starters, right? And I think the main area of controversy that we can point at is the fact that there are 2 Knicks starters over the 2 teams ahead of them in the Eastern Conference right now, the Celtics and the Cavs. And I know a lot of people within both of those fan bases would be clamoring for players such as Derek White from the Celtics, maybe even Chris Stapps, the way he's been playing as of late. And then for the Cavs, definitely guys like Garland and guys like Mobley to start. But here's the thing about the 2 Knicks starters, who are obviously Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns. I feel like at their respective positions, and because of the way they play, most importantly the volume of time they are on the court, it really lends value to their all-star cases. Let's start off with Karl Anthony Towns, because the main player he's most likely rivaling in people's minds, or at the time of not just all-star voting, but fan voting as well, was Evan Mobley. And if you compare them, Evan Mobley, in my opinion, is the far more efficient player, playing a much bigger role in his squad and impacting them in a much larger manner. But Cat because he plays such a high volume and he's integrated himself so seamlessly into this New York Knicks starting five, I think you can make the case that he's not just arguably the best center in the Eastern Conference, but playing some of the best basketball at the position as of late, heading into the All-Star game especially. He's coming off of, 2 straight 40-point performances. So I feel like although the case can definitely be made that Evan Mobley's improvement could have saw him get a starting role in one of these teams, and I think he's going to see a lot of minutes on Team Kenny, I do feel like Karl Anthony Towns just made himself even more high profile, not just from this trade to the Knicks, but how he's fit in this system, especially the next guy in question, Jalen Brunson. They run one of the most dangerous pick and rolls in the league. But that's not the reason why Brunson's inclusion as a starter is as contentious as it is. I think that because of both of these players playing so well together, it's kind of fair to lump them into the same mindset of inclusion as starters. But for Brunson, it's a little bit easier to describe, in my opinion, because at least for Cat, you can point to his volume over a guy like Mobley, and especially his experience over a guy like Mobley as the reason as to why he was included as a starter. But for Brunson, just look at the depth in the East in terms of backcourt players. Obviously, Trae Young was chosen as the injury replacement for Giannis Antetokounmpo. And you have a guy like Tyrese Maxey, who's now averaging the most points in the Eastern Conference at the point guard position. And Tyler Hero, because now the absence of Jimmy Butler, not just for the past weeks, but for a long time now because he's off to Golden State, amping up his minutes and usage rate. Jalen Brunson doesn't necessarily have that much competition. You can point to certain guys in the Eastern Conference that could have made a case, but I feel like due to circumstances outside of their control, Tyrese Maxey and Tyler Hero were kind of forced into that role. Jalen Brunson has been doing this consistently. Then you look to guys, say, like Cade Cunningham and Tyrese Halliburton, and then a guy like Damian Lillard who expect to be in the conversation as well. Damian Lillard really right now is starting to become more of a closer rather than an all-around player like Brunson, in my opinion. He definitely has the shooting prowess, but I don't necessarily know if he has the consistent level and the bag of tricks that Jalen Brunson has. And we point to a guy like Halliburton. Halliburton last year could have made the case to be on par with Jalen Brunson, but this year has fallen off dramatically, as well as this Indiana Pacers team. So the fact that the Pacers and Halliburton aren't performing equally as well as we expect them to, that sees him lose a bit of his luster. And Cade Cunningham really is playing at a very high level himself, but he's on a surprising Detroit Pistons team that, although a lot of people really have seemingly been higher on them as of late, are not necessarily a high-profile team where Cade Cunningham and his skills are on high display all the time. And then let's point to the last guy of interest here, but actually the last two guys considering on how you viewed a guy like Donovan Mitchell, both Garland and Mitchell, right? And that's where the controversy stems from. If Garland and Mitchell played in a bigger market, say, and potentially didn't necessarily have to play off each other all the time, then I could see a way for both of them potentially be starters because of Jalen Brunson's volume of play, even though he hasn't necessarily been playing the most minutes in the Eastern Conference at the position. What with his tandem with Karl Anthony Towns, what with the fact that they both play in a New York market that gets a lot of attention on the third best team in the Eastern Conference. I feel like that kind of trumps what Garland and Mitchell are doing, even though in my eyes the underlying metrics say that Garland and Mitchell are doing the more impressive work for this highly overachieving, in my opinion, Cleveland Cavaliers team. So that's kind of the criticism of at least the starters here. Then we get to the reserves, and a lot of them fall in Team Kenny's camp, right? Because these guys are considered the quote-unquote, not in my honest opinion, the afterthoughts of the Eastern Conference. Obviously, we just talked about Cunningham and Garland, and because of their play, they're kind of lock reserves. Cunningham elevating the Detroit Pistons, Garland overachieving with Cleveland. Then you look down the list, you have guys like Tyler Hero, whose role was made even larger over the past couple of weeks due to the absence of Jimmy Butler, who's now off to Golden State, like we just said. Then you have, I think, Tyrese Maxey will play for Team Kenny. Don't quote me on that because I didn't necessarily check all of Team Kenny's roster, to be honest with you. I don't have much hope for them in this tournament-style format. But I do think that ultimately, when you look at the reserves that the East have, they're a lot weaker than we can say about the West. Because the West, to me, has a lot of international talent that's going to be on Team Charles Barkley, who I'm really intrigued to see. And then you go into the Rising Stars team, and there are definitely some players that will excite more so on the Western Conference side of things. But there are several locks, in my mind, for the East All-Star reserve that definitely deserve to be there. Garland for his play, Cunningham, Hero, Maxey. The most egregious person left out, LaMelo Ball. And I think that's more so as to how Charlotte's performing, and not just his performance in a nutshell, but it's pretty damning to have someone with LaMelo Ball stats not in the All-Star game. But I do think that the East Conference overall has been a little bit weaker than we expected this year. But let me know what you think in the comments about all the Eastern Conference All-Stars, because there are a lot of questions that can still be asked. But coming next, we transition to the West to talk about all the controversy questions and probably answer some of those questions in the next segment right after this short break. But continue to let me know what you think of the Eastern Conference All-Stars in the comment section below.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm